Yeah. So hey, look, this is a new style for Jim. This is called a deep dive, and so what you're going to hear from is two Jersey boys. They're going to talk back and forth, and when I say talk back and forth, I'm the guy that asks interesting questions, and Mr. Moody over here is the one that's going to talk about some things that are really fundamental to the basic construct of an entrepreneur, a startup company, a business in growth, a business as exit, what it means in the psychology of an entrepreneur, right? What happens in the brain of an entrepreneur, all highs, all lows, and kind of nothing in between. How do entrepreneurs look at and allocate resources? How do they make hiring decisions? How do they align their values to include family and faith as priorities as they go into any kind of business transaction? And so, right, we often talk about...
You didn't mention all those things in our call yesterday.
Yeah,
That's a lot of stuff.
We did a little bit. I'll ask
Right.
a couple questions. And so we often talk about how do you do IP? How do you look at raising money? Which are all tactical questions, and they're great, and we'll get to those. But this is a deep dive into the psyche of a multi-success entrepreneur. And so we're going to have this conversation between two Jersey boys up here. And then what we want to do is make sure we open it up for the question and answer, because I think that will really define some of the finer pieces that go into this. There's plenty of entrepreneurs here. And what we talked about a little bit yesterday was, in an organization or an environment like this, you bring up folks who've been successful, and you say, I want to be just like that, right? Every one of us have a different entrepreneurial journey, and so the idea is you take bits and pieces from all the folks that you listen to, cobble into your journey, and then you are the ones that are ultimately successful and get to kind of come up here on the stage like Mr. Scott. But it's really important that we started some of the basics and really understand what it means to be an entrepreneur, because we're crazy, right? Entrepreneurs are not normal folks. We have different risk-reward profiles. We have different applications of this thing called time. We're going to talk a little bit about work-life balance and how that's really not a term. You have to figure out what that means. And so if we're not asking the right questions in this kind of conversation, we'll open it up for you guys to kind of make sure we ask the right ones. I'm going to ask Scott to kind of go through his journey, and his journey is pretty amazing in a lot of different areas. It's often interesting when you get a bio from a gentleman as resourceful and successful as Mr. Scott, and the first thing he talks about is family, and it's got 4 bullet points on it. If you actually did any research that Scott looked at, you could go on for encyclopedias worth of background and data, but that shows the humility that goes into, right, this thing called an entrepreneur. So we're going to sit down now. I'm going to start asking some questions, and then again, the feedback between you guys and us is really critical, so let us know when you want to have some questions, okay? So Scott, again, thank you for really spending a couple minutes with us today, and our conversation yesterday was amazing. Would you just start at the beginning of your journey and talk us through what's important to you, how you prioritize, and then how you come to this thing called Retirement Semi version 3?
Yeah. So, it's a journey, right? My opinion and things I'll share today are not the same as they were 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? Despite the fact that at roughly, 17 or 18, I knew pretty much everything, right? So it turned out
that was a joke.
true.
Now everybody's got a laugh
Right.
at that point.
So it turns out you have to be 67 before you really know everything, and I just hit that milestone.
Did you?
Yeah.
So you know it all now?
So, yeah,
Okay.
no, so. Look, it is, so just as background, right, I went to state, I was raised in Jersey, went to state,
Being Penn
graduated in, NC State, and then graduated with industrial and systems engineering degree. Literally graduated one weekend, didn't go to graduation. I worked that day. Got married the next weekend to Catherine, right, now 44 years. And we moved to Florida, right, 3 days later, right? So, so I worked for a larger company, Harris Semiconductor. It was really a great experience for getting ready to be an entrepreneur. In fact, often, right, college graduates will ask me, or, just new grads, will, say, what do I need to do to be an entrepreneur? And it was like, get a job. Like, you need to know something, right? Like, you know how many bar apps I've seen from new grad engineers or new grads just out of college? Why? Because bars is the only thing they know, right? So, So, look, it was a semiconductor company, started as a new grad engineer, moved up to run a division, and then, started working with this other guy, Dale Setlak, my co-founder of what became AuthenTec, on this new idea that the company didn't really want to support. So we ended up, leaving and starting a company called AuthenTec, right? Raised about $70 million in venture, Sierra Ventures, Carlyle Group, Texas Instruments. Took the company public, which was pretty cool, honestly. The day we went public, the company opened the stock exchange, and my 3 daughters actually rang the bell that day to open the stock exchange, right? Which is a pretty good thing to share. And one of the things I tell people, and it's true for what has happened in all my life. I'm just telling you some of the good things right now. I joke with people, right? They were all kind of in the later mid-teenage years. I can assure you at least one of them hated me that day. I don't know which one. It was quite variable back then. And, but everybody looks at our family as, generally in a positive light. But they only see, right, part of it. And so, you're living the life you do. You look at Facebook, right, and, everybody's kids are happy. They're smiling. Everybody's on vacation. Everybody but you. Like, what's wrong with my family? What's wrong with me? And it's the same thing in business, right? Can't tell you how many times people come up to me, at work and go like, oh, look at this competitor or this, and they're doing all these wonderful things. And I'm like, I know that company, right? They stink, right? And it's like, yeah, but I saw it on LinkedIn. It's like, do you ever read our LinkedIn? Like, if you did, you'd think we were the greatest company in the whole world, right? So, there's a lot of mess, right, behind, what you see. And what you see is often not the truth. I won't say the truth, but it doesn't really show reality, and that's one of the things. So we started AuthenTec, took it public. Eventually, a few years later, that sucked, right? Like, I'm glad we were public, but we went public in 2007. I don't know if people remember 2008 and 2009, but the financial world was falling apart. We had 5 bankers. 2 lead bankers were Bear Stearns and Lehman, and they were both completely out of business within 12 months of our going public. My life sucked, right? And so I can share like how bad it got, at least in my mental abilities. But so eventually it was acquired by Apple, became the Touch ID. Most of our team still works for Apple. That's very unusual. They usually just take a couple people, move them to Cupertino with the IP. But doing what we did was very hard. We had like 230 patents when we were acquired. And so that most of that team, at least all the engineers and ops, still reside in Melbourne, Florida. And they've actually added to that team since then. Retired here to Raleigh. I'm an all-in kind of person. I'm not that smart, right? So I make up for that with a lot of hard work and heart. But it's exhausting. And so I swore I would never work again, double swore I would never do another startup, but wanted to be involved in entrepreneurialism. Mentioned the idea of moving to North Carolina, one day, like when the deal went through to Catherine. This is a long answer, but
You've gone through all 20 questions.
Yeah. So mentioned it to Catherine within about an hour and a half. Her 8 brothers and sisters and parents knew or had this idea that we might be moving to North Carolina, and then moved up here. Was very involved in entrepreneurialism in the Raleigh area. Really liked it. A lot of other things. I won't go into the stories now, but I was on a trip to Rwanda. Been there multiple times. This one on a specific mission trip, and met somebody. Thought I needed to do more in my life, right, for all the blessings I've had in my life. Came back. Unfortunately, I don't know how to do much, right? Laying on the couch is really not considered a skill. And So had the idea of, us starting another company. Now, Catherine's not my co-founder in the new company, but it was our money, right? And, as we'll talk about, it's a family commitment. So we ended up starting K4Connect. I won't go through what we do, but a couple years later, I met this gentleman. The whole idea was if the company was successful, we could use the proceeds from that to help others. And so that was the whole idea. And then 2 years in, I met this gentleman with MS and realized the calling was not just the money from any potential success, but the technology itself. So literally over a cup of coffee, pivoted the entire company to focus on older adults and people living with disabilities. Was supposed to retire in 20. Oh, guess what happened in 20? So that was the end of that. Agreed to work through, last year. Kind of retired as CEO the end of last year, more fully retired, and then we moved here in June. 2 of our daughters live here, and then 2 of our grandchildren as well. Well, actually, our only 2 grandchildren.
So I'm gonna pivot, and we're gonna talk about pivoting. Catherine, we're gonna ask you some questions here as well, because we're gonna talk about the dynamics of the family in this entrepreneurial journey. Because a lot of times that's a misnomer, and people will wave their hand at partner one, and if you don't get that right, it makes the rest of the days really, really hard. So hold on, we'll get to you in a second. So, I mean, that's a story of how many years? Condensed in about 6 minutes? 45?
Yeah, 44 years.
Yeah.
My whole life is like 44 years married, 44 years working, 44.
You're doing something right. So if you would, talk about, right, your personal thesis, right, where your priorities are, how you prioritize, and we talked about, family and faith as a going in kind of, not a variable, not a priority, must have in the way you look at relationships, in the way you look at your business, where you spend your time, and then eventually how you give back later. Can you just talk about that?
So there's really 2 sides of that. I didn't get into my earlier vision or kind of thinking, but later in my 20s, and I'll tell you why that changed. Well, let me just start with that, right? Yeah. So look, we were poor growing up, right? We lived in a relatively wealthy town. My dad lost his job in '72, never really got another one. And, it was tough. And I was a freshman in high school, quit, all my sports, which was really no big loss to sports, right? So I could work full time. And I worked at the Acme supermarket from 3 to 9 every day after school and then on weekends, right? Taught me a great work ethic. But, by the time, I can remember just driving miles so my parents could use food stamps, but they didn't want to see their friends or neighbors, to see them use that. And then, I'm a big fan of the safety net, right? Look, if we weren't poor, I couldn't have gone to college, right? Because, I would co-op, work 1 semester and go to school 1 semester, but I also got grants and, full grants. Back then they were called BEOG, but I don't know what they're called now. So, whatever. I feel like I'm having a Biden moment right now. So, so when I got it. So when I got out of college, folks, man, I just wanted to be rich. Like, I was just going to make a crap load of money. And, I was doing really well at Harris and moving along. And, I did not want children. So it turns out, late 20s, maybe early 30s, I don't remember exactly when, but it turned out that I was named a co-chair of a Joint Chiefs of Staff study on the mobilization of smart munitions in a military crisis. It was a big deal, right? There were like 12 contractors back then, right? A lot of them have consolidated, right? And about 900 subcontractors. And so I was at the Pentagon all the time. I met Admiral Crowe back then, right? And it was a big deal. And there was going to be this big meeting and big dinner out in California. And I went out and, to co-chair it. And I got a call from Catherine. Her grandmother, Mary Brew, had passed away. And, she was like, wanted to let you know, but you don't need to come home, right? It's up in Western Virginia, the funeral, and, it's in a day or something like that. So I was like, no, I'll be there. I'm going to come home, right? So I flew home, right, late one night. I went to the event for about a day, and I flew home, or I flew back to, I flew to somewhere in Virginia, and I got in late in the hotel, this little rickety hotel, and the next morning we got up, go to the funeral, and I hadn't really been to a family funeral before, right? And so we walked in this room, and there was a room, you know, probably close to this size, at least what I remember, right? And it was packed, right, with family members. And I was like, wow, like, you know, and that pulled a heartstring, right? I just realized, like, you know, how impactful this woman was, right? All these people who I was really getting back so that it wouldn't be like just Catherine and a few people at this church, right? I figured I could help fill up at least one pew. There was all these people in the room, and that, you know, cut a nerve. And we walked into the church. When we walked in, the church was packed, like packed, right? Every pew, there were people sitting in the back. And I just realized the priorities in my life were all wrong, right? That Mary Brew had touched more people in her life, right? And nobody's ever heard of Mary Brew, right? Like, you know, from Western Virginia, right? Had been in a nursing home, what they called nursing homes back then. And I was like, she had touched more people in her life than I ever could, no matter how rich I was. And the next weekend, right, took Catherine out to a nice restaurant in Melbourne, Florida, where we lived, and it was like, you know, I've gotten my priorities wrong in life. Let's have children. You know, she was all gung-ho for that. And, you know, honestly, if we had started earlier, we would have had more, right? But each pregnancy became a little bit more difficult. And you know, I learned like why God doesn't have kids come out as teenagers, because you'd never have more than one. But anyway, that said, you know, and that just changed my whole perspective of work. Look, I like work, right? To me, it's my sport. If I was bigger, taller, faster, really had any athletic ability whatsoever, I would have loved to have been an athlete, and then a professional athlete, and then a coach. I could easily be that 80-year-old guy running up and down the sideline in a football game, the veins popping out of their neck. I could be that, right? But I don't have any of those capabilities. So the way I look at it was, work was my sport. It is the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, the old Wide World of Sports commercial, right? It's the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. And you know, being an entrepreneur puts that on a, you know, speed dial. But the fact of the matter is, the most important things in my life, bar none, are God and family. Right? And you know, to the point we were talking about yesterday, it's really bringing. I don't believe in this idea of work-life balance. Right? Life is, you know, a pie with about 1,000 slices, and you have to kind of try to bring them all together in a cohesive state, right? And that's where I see, you know, is, you know, what I'm working on today, K4, even AuthenTec, right? Was this idea of, you know, serving and helping others, and really melding, right, you know, your faith, your work, if you will, right, and your family. And look, AuthenTec, we wouldn't have made it through AuthenTec if it wasn't for Catherine. She was as important to making that happen as any single person in AuthenTec. So anyway, that's my view, but it changed, right? Like, all because of Mary Brew, who touched everybody I've touched in my life, because she doesn't even know it, has really been touched by Mary.
Your personal thesis of God and family. How did you apply that in the business world? Did you look through that lens when you hired folks, when you looked to partner, when you made strategic relationships? How did you apply that value set to the business mode?
Look, pretty much everybody that I work with, right, understands those are my things. You know, I almost always say, you know, God bless you when I leave a phone call, right? You know, I sign all my emails in service, right? But you know, look, they have, you know, there's that faith element, but you know, you only want to, you know, even people K4 like is Christian, no, right? But it is, right, you know, our morals are dictated by, you know, my faith. And so I think one thing, right, is that you got to like the people you work with, right? And they have to know who you are, and you stick with your, you know, I always stick with my principles, right? I get a lot wrong, right? But I try to always stick, you know, to my principles, and those principles are guided by my faith, right? And then how you deal with family, you know, through all of that is, look, it's a decision. I see people make a mistake all the time, right? It's a decision you have to make. If you have a significant other, a spouse, right, then that's a discussion you have to have, right? Because your workload and your pressure, you know, the ups and downs of your life, they're going to change. I don't care how hard you work for a big company, right? Like, and we all feel like we're under pressure sometimes in a big company. Gave me a lot of training, but if my project didn't work, right, my product didn't work, whatever I was working on didn't work, Harris Corporation was still going to be there tomorrow. That's not true for your startup. It's going to go away, and you're going to impact the lives of all the people, right, that you talked into joining your company, all the customers that you talked into. Now I take the, you know, buying your product, all the investors that you talked into. So I, you know, one of my issues, right, is I take it very personally. And so, you know, when the stock market crashed, you know, I went into what I now know was a deep depression, right? Like it was my fault. I remember going to my priest and I'm like, you know, but John, you know, I did this and I did that, right? And he's like, look, Scott, the whole world's falling apart, right? You wouldn't believe how many people are in church right now. Nobody's giving us any money, but there is a lot of people in the pews, right? And so, but, you know, I took it like I'm losing these people's money, right? You know, I'm potentially laying off some of our people. You know, I took that all exceedingly, you know, personally. And so that was, you know, that was a problem. But I do think people generally, like how you act.
Right.
Right. And look, I tell people that ever interviewed at, even back at Harris, but certainly AuthenTec and K4, you know, you need to know two things. One, being in a startup is an unbelievable lot of work. You think you're working 9 to 5, like, don't kid yourself, right, especially early on. Number two, you got to know Moody, right, is not a wholly inappropriate last name, right? So, you know, there's an intensity, there's a passion about me that can, you know, at least in some people's eyes can cross the line sometimes, right? So I say I'm sorry a lot. But, you know, it's holding on to those, you know, kind of principles.
Can we dig into AuthenTec and the product?
Yeah, so, Catherine, what's your thought on that? What do you, right, here's the other side of the equation, just a couple quick comments to get the perspective, and then we're going to go into AuthenTec and the absolute. I know you are.
No, actually, you have to be supportive. It's almost like having a puppy dog. It's unconditional love. You have to get through the bumps, the highs,
Wow.
the lows. You have to have patience.
I don't pee on the carpet.
Not yet.
You really need to think things
Yeah.
through. You really need to let the entrepreneur talk things out. Because sometimes they can talk things out, answer their own questions without realizing it. So I think being a good listener is probably a good piece of that.
Super.
Just being there, period.
Being present, yeah.
Look, let me tell you why AuthenTec continued, right? So the first chip came out, semiconductor, pretty hard, right? It takes a lot of money. The first chip doesn't usually, you know, work perfectly. and you have to spin it, right? And, I think we had spent like $5 million, and found out our first chip didn't work. And I don't mean didn't work well, I meant it didn't work, right? Like I joke with people like, I don't know if any electrons are going in the thing, but they're damn sure aren't any coming out, right? And so, the first day we realized that we called the team meeting, it was 20 engineers and, smart engineers and myself. And, I started the meeting, it was like 8 or 9 o'clock at night, right? And I was like, how many people don't think we're going to make it? And in semiconductor, you have, we were all in our 30s, 40s, 50s, right? And so we were pretty experienced. And I think of like the 20 people in the room, like 15 raised their hand. And honestly, I would have raised my hand, but I thought it would look bad, right? So, I gave a little bit of a rah, this is what we're going to do. This, and we knew how to stage things, and, we knew what to do, right? But it didn't work to start. And so, I said, look, let's look at this and do this tomorrow. And then we went out and, went drinking, right? Not a lot. We just went over to the Bennigan's across the street. So the next day, we're all in early, we're working, we got a plan, right? So on and so forth, another 8 or 9 o'clock meeting. And, I lay out, here's the schedule, we're going to do this, we're going to have these back in 2 weeks, right? You got to fly there, right? It was all planned out. And, we went out drinking again. So, which is an important part of being in a startup. And so I went home that night, and Catherine and I were sitting in the living room, which is the only time I ever remember sitting in that living room other than Christmas. And we were sitting on the couch, and man, I'm pouring out. Like, we're sitting on the couch, and I'm just like, I've ruined our lives. I'm so sorry. Like, we spent all our money, right? We have 3 young kids in school, right? Like, oh my God, what have I done? I went back and for 2 hours, right? I just whined. I cried. I whined. I'm sure Catherine said something during that 2 hours, but I don't remember, right? I was just like, I've ruined our lives, and I am so sorry. And at the end, she said, you know what to do, so just go do it. Right, literally, I remember that to this day. And she could have said, see if you can get your old, VP GM job back at Harris, right? I know they like you, right? So on and so forth, right? Or, you need to do something else, but she didn't. And so, went back, I pulled up my big boy britches, right? It turns out I was, probably depressed as well, but didn't realize it. We went back, the chip got it back a couple weeks. It worked, not fully the way but it was enough to, get to the, we had raised $13 million, right, on our very first round. And already spent $5 million and had a chip that didn't work, right? So without Catherine, like truly that company wouldn't have existed.
Can you talk a little bit more about chip not working and what that means in your ability to then, right, pivot, cycle, innovate, iterate to get to something that works? Because that's an important process in all of our startup world, because that is hard. You come out of the box with something, you think it's great, it's not great.
Right.
So how did you think through that process? Because obviously it seemed to work in the end, I think, a little bit.
Is this the chip you sold to Apple eventually?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Little thing like that.
So, look, I said it in the beginning, right, go get a job. And there are really a few aspects of that, right? So one is, right, I meet a lot of people and they'll go out and ask what a customer wants and so on and so forth. Like, if you ask what a customer wants, it's going to be late and it's going to be wrong, right? Because most of the time they're just telling you, like, this little incremental improvement they want on somebody else's product. So you come out with that and they're like, well, that other company does these 42 other things. Do you do those? Well, no, but you didn't say that. Well, right? So, right, the whole idea of a startup is to coming out and solving a problem that maybe they didn't even know they had, right? And so the only way you're going to learn that, right, is to play in that industry in one way or the other. The second thing that it gave me was, right, you know, I knew how to run a bigger operation. So there was a tremendous amount of benefit to that. And in my case, in semiconductor, right, like, you know, a chip today costs $50 million to figure out if it works, right? Back then it was, you know, a good 5 to 10 million. And so, you know, you did all kinds of things around the electronics, right? So for example, we wanted to play in multiple end markets. There's something where people talk about entrepreneurs taking a lot of risk. It's all about risk management, actually. So even when we thought about, like, let's go develop this chip and we're going to, I remember the chart, right? We had a chip in the middle, a picture of a chip, a fake picture of a chip, right? And a bunch of markets we were going to play in, PCs, cell phones, right? Cell phones, they were flip phones at the time, right? Automotive, security, so on and so forth, right? And so each one of those requires different IOs to be integrated, right, into their electronic system. So we put them all on the same chip, made the chip bigger, right? But like, I didn't want to try to guess which market was going to take off first. And so I didn't really care about the cost of the chip too much because we were going to take care of that in our product roadmap. And so as soon as, you know, we figured out, we started throwing off IOs, right? Like PCs going, like, let's go to that. Like, you know, this is going, let's go to that, right? So there would be a chip specific for that end market. Eventually, we just got down to the PC and the wireless market because they were growing so much. We were like, let's dump, you know, all the others, right? In electronics, in a semiconductor device, right, you usually have the IOs on the chip itself, right, on the outer edges, right? So, but there's a lot of parts of the electronics you really can't figure out what's wrong with it, right? So we designed it, like we all do this, right? So they had IOs, right, in the center. Eventually we got rid of those as well. But those are the things that allow us to go figure out what is really causing this thing, right, not to work, because we weren't getting any signals on the other IOs. It was breaking down somewhere. We had staged wafers, right, and we'll go into it, but at the end of a wafer fab process, right, which is, you know, 9 to 12 weeks minimum. So, you know, it's not like a quick turn, like, let's write some more code tonight, right, we had staged wafers before metal, right? So some of the fixes we implemented were just fixed in metal, right, instead of in the core of the wafer, where you really want it, but we could gather enough information, right? So when that chip came out, it wasn't production ready, but we figured out where the issues were and we were able to solve it, right? And so that's why, you know, you don't have like, you know, new grad BS engineers, right, starting semiconductor companies. It's hard, it's expensive, right? And, you know, you have to have a lot of experience. And so you're going to get that experience, right, working for, you know, a software company or whatever you do. You know how to manage things. But it's really, you're really always thinking through, like, how do I manage my risk here? Like, I'm going to target PCs. Well, what if that market doesn't work out like you thought, right? Now, I don't mean when I say don't talk to customers, not exactly that, right? It's really you're bringing an idea to the customer, right, and seeing if they like it, right, or validate it. On the other side of that, right, and by the way, you know something about their market. You're not just going in and like, well, what kind of things could you use at this restaurant that would help you, you know, run a restaurant better? So, so to me, it's really about, you know, learning the space you're in, whether it's operational or the end market, the problem that you're solving, right? And then managing your risk.
Application, because it's time and money and resources to get all those patents.
So one is, it's the whole reason Apple bought us,
'Cause you were a
right?
patent house.
Yeah, well, because we had such strong patents in this area that they wanted to go into. So they had we had come out with we were coming out with a new product. You know, we ran it by them. They were pretty interested. We had been keeping it secret, right? It eventually turned into the first Touch ID. And then we had, you know, 3 people interested. They gave us a contract to make some modifications to it, right? $5 million contract. I thought it was going to cost us like $100,000, but it was a good deal. And So we were going to make those, modifications, and concurrently we're negotiating a production contract. Well, their production contract is like this thick. It's like unbelievable. And they are very tough negotiators, right? They all think they're Steve Jobs, right? So, or at least have his attitude, And so they were negotiating that, and we came down to the patent section. The patent section basically says, right, without saying it directly, like, you can never sue us and we can do anything we want. And so we said no, particularly me, right? And it was just like, I'm not going to sign that. And like everybody else does. Well, I see what you do to other companies, right? Like, you basically use their stuff for 2 years. At the end, you have a big semiconductor group. You come out with the product yourself, right? And then they go, boom, because you are so demanding, you're 90% of your volume, their volume, right, and so on and so forth. So we wouldn't do it. And then they said, okay, we'll license them from you. Great, it's like, I think we said $400 million, which is what they ended up buying us for. So they were, they offered like $1.25. So we went back and forth a few times and finally said, look, we don't want other people to use this product. And second, right, we want those patents. And so they ended up paying, roughly $400 million cash for the company. The way I look at patents is, I totally agree with your philosophy at Philips, right? So, we had some core principles that, or I can't remember what we called them, right, focus items, and one of them was speed, right? Like, patents, people say is defensible. It's like bullshit if it's defensible. Like, we're a little startup. You think I'm suing Apple or Microsoft or, I always laugh when I watch two startups with no money sue one another. Like, if you win, what do you get, And so we had 3 people sue us for patents, and we crushed them all, right? Biblically, I'm not a real believer. I've never sued anybody. Been sued a few times, right? Never lost, never settled. If you're right, you don't have to. Like, we can settle ourselves, right? But 3 times, and just give you one example. Atmel, big semiconductor company, right? We were a pukey little company. They had bought a French company that had a little, a really crappy little fingerprint sensor, right? But their CEO really loved the idea and loved the product and so on and so forth. And so I was always talking about that was they're going to be their big next market. And they were already a multi-billion-dollar company. And so one of our board members was at an investment banking conference, and after he spoke, he was speaking to a small group, and somebody asked him about AuthenTec, right, the lawsuit, and he said, I'm either going to, buy that company or put him out of business, right? And so we were really aggressive in reply, and as settlement, right, of the patent lawsuit, right? They licensed us all their patents. They only had 6, and they were crap anyway, right? They paid us, right? I think I was under NDA for a long time, but I don't think it counts, like 20 years later. They paid us like $25 million, right? Which was big money to us back then. And they withdrew from the business, right? They exited the biometric business, right? And so that's what patents did for us, right? If you're looking at a PE company that might buy you, they don't care. They just care about your ARR and a multiple of that. But big companies like an Apple, even a Philips, Microsoft, they do pay attention to your patents, right? And so yes, it is hard, it is expensive, but the semiconductor is a real patent game. And we actually did a lot of security products as well. And so those were really important. That said, right, between both companies, we have another 30, 40 at K4, right? And that's all software. We have, between those 2 companies, there's 270 patents. My name is on exactly 2. Which shows the entire intellectual contribution I've made to both of those companies, right?
So given that, I mean, how would you, what would you offer to startups to think through, right, balancing the time and cost to get a patent versus getting a product to market?
So first off, right, it's speed of getting a product to market. You know, there's all kinds of things you can do to protect yourself if it's good, right? Provisionals and so on and so forth. You can write a provisional. It's a few $1,000 and you can put everything you ever thought of in a provisional, right? It gives you a year, right? But there might be one or two things, right? You're just going to get, and we did take some of the patents, the seminal patents, and apply for foreign patents as well, Japan, China, Europe, right, so on and so forth. And so, but you're right, it's all about, here's what you know, even when I talk to people today and I'm like, investors would ask this, investors will ask this, right? What I'm really saying most often is you should be asking those questions, right? And so one of the things is that in the patent, I'm a big fan of tech, right? Like, give me a, you know, some core competency, right, that is of value beyond just like I have ARR, right? So, you know, what is unique about your company, right, other than you're selling the same thing they did that they could whip up in an hour and a half, right? What is that intellectual property? And so I don't think I would really get into a company that didn't have, whether you get a patent or not, but that there is some core competency that is better than what other people can do. And that's the more important thing, right? The patent is an outreach of that, right? And if it's really good, like, let's go patent it.
Can we clarify what the AuthenTec product was, the fingerprint? Because not everyone in the room is aware of what the chip did. So if you can clarify that it was the thumbprint security for the phone.
Yeah, it was the thumbprint security for the phone. It's the, you know, the Touch ID that was used on the iPhone, right? It's still used on tablets and laptops, right? And in my opinion, it was a hell of a lot better than the facial recognition, which I find super annoying. But you know, that's what we did, and we kind of ushered in this whole idea. I was a real big believer that it would be used by consumer, right? My original vision for the phone is that in Japan, where I spent a lot of time, your phone, right, was really kind of your ID and a piece of jewelry, right? I just would always joke with people like, you know, you get on a jet, back then you would get on a Japanese subway and everybody's holding on and just, you know, playing a game or doing something on their phone. This is long before you saw the kind of same thing here. And I thought the more and more that goes into the phone, the more you want to protect it, right? That has my information, it might unlock my doors, it might, I had all those visions a long time ago, right? My piece of it, right, that vision was, you know, you have to protect that, right? And you know, I gave examples of, you know, being in a baseball game and watching your kid strike out for the third time and, like, you know, going, you know, on the web and buying something to help them, you know, hit baseballs, right? Whatever. So it's kind of like this whole idea of instantaneous, you know, gratification, right? And so, you know, again, the more that phone had in it, the more you wanted to protect it. I was against, you know, most of the industry was opposite of me, right? Most of it really saw it as more government related or corporate related. They also saw it, you prove to me who you are and I'll allow you to have something. And I was like, screw you, I'll just get a different credit card, I'll get a different phone, right, whatever. I had this whole talk, it's all about you. How do I make your life easier? Because passwords, even back then, were starting to become a pain in the neck. How do I secure the things you own, right? How do I enhance your privacy? And that's the exact thing that Apple, right, did and really took from us, right? And so when I do that, you'll use it. And then when you use it, all the benefit will flow, right, to others, right? So if you think about, you know, using your Touch ID and Apple Pay, right, it's easy, I use it all the time, right, et cetera, et cetera. You use it because it's of value to you. But when you use it, right? The merchant benefits, right? The credit card company benefits, Apple benefits, right? The bank benefits, but you've never used Touch ID or Apple Pay for the benefit of any of those other entities, right? And so, yes, we were selling to Apple. We were selling. A lot of people didn't agree with that, right, philosophy. I also didn't believe that the algorithm, which many people were using, kind of government-related algorithms, all of your templates, which is a mathematical representation of what your fingerprint looks like, should be stored in the cloud, right, in these big databases. Because, right, big databases of your security key, like someone's going to attack that, right? And eventually they're going to win. And, you know, the best way, right, the best security is that if somebody steals it, you don't care. Like, then what value is it to them as well? So if my template was only stored and tied to the microprocessor on whatever electronic device I was on, if you stole that, didn't really make any difference. You just go get a new phone, right? Because your template would be modified based on, right, the processor on that phone. And so that's exactly what, I think it had we had better technology than everybody else, but I think it was those things that really led Apple to, you know, end up acquiring.
So I'm going to ask you about your thoughts on future security. Who in here has a data play in their startup or business? More higher hands, right? Almost everybody. Who uses data? Everybody, right? So this data encryption thing, this protection, this blockchain level analysis, right, putting the information in an area, it's zeros and ones, so when it does get hacked, you don't care, is really, really important for a lot of, I mean, most businesses are all data either oriented or processed now. So what's your thought on the future of data security? And I'm not talking CIA level stuff, I'm just talking for general consumers and general business.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay, that's great. So, wide open space. No, so.
Look, I mean, it's just not an area I focus on anymore, right? And like, despite the fact that I had all kinds of clearances and encryption and clearances and so on and so forth, right? That's what all the smart people, you know, remember when I told you I only did 2 of those 270 patents? Yeah, the 168 really smart people did that. I just get the philosophies. I hope to get the philosophies right.
Sounds like you got them okay. I'm not a math guy, but 400 million sounds like an okay win. Questions? All right, so let's ask some really good questions. We've kind of opened the door. We've talked about the personal side, some psychology of the entrepreneur, the DNA, some decision making, some pivoting, you know, your personal thesis behind it. Let's ask some good questions. Yes, sir.
So if you go back to when you were in negotiations with Apple, I mean, this is 2011, 2012?
It was 2012.
So you're kind of out of the recession, but the market certainly hasn't come back. You're on the 90-day shot clock of being a public company. How did you maintain the conviction or fortitude to hold steady on that negotiation rather than cave to Apple?
So by then, I was supposed to retire as I was burnt as the CEO 1 year after our IPO, right? Already had our COO and president in place, who I started with in 1980 on the same day at Harris Semiconductor and lived across the street, right? And then the world fell apart. He didn't want to take over and the board didn't want me to leave. So I committed to 2 more years, right? And then we were doing an acquisition, right? And the board wanted me to stay on another year, and I refused, right? And so Larry did take over. So look, I'm going to tell you right now, Apple was super hard to deal with, right? And it lasted a really long time, right? The negotiations, on again, off again, right, for 9 months. But, you know, I talk to Larry all the time, right? He has much more patience than me. You know, some negative aspects of my personality probably would have shown at an Apple meeting. And they are ruthless, tough, and mean, right? And so, but in the end of the day, like you have to stick with your guns, right? Like you have to believe in what you're saying, right? And so, you know, there was some brinkmanship and there was walkaways, but, you know, there was just no way we were going to do that on the patents. And, you know, I can't say that the other board members would agree with me, but Larry and I agreed, right? And so, I can remember once when I was at Microsoft and we were negotiating, right, one of our algorithms to be integrated into their BIOS. And they came to a head on something. I don't remember what the detail was. And I just said no. Like, we're, not going to, well, if you don't do that, we're going to do this other guy, and we're not going to use you, right? And it was like, yeah, we're not, I'd love to do business with you, but we're not going to do that, right? So I left, and a couple guys, we went back to the hotel, right? Like, I was like practically crying, like I've ruined our lives, like how, blah, blah, blah. Then we got a phone call, right? And they agreed, right? And, part of that was something that happened earlier, and, we kind of stuck with our principles, and they appreciated that, it turned out, and, part of their final decision was, kind of the kind of company they wanted to work with, right? But let me tell you, negotiating with the big dudes, right, it's really hard. And they know they have all the power, and they have more and more power like every year. My personal opinion, they're all way too big now. But again, it gets back to, what are we trying to do? And, it ended up working out. But there was a lot of discussions, a lot of arguments, right? Even internally, like, it's not going to be an issue, we ought to do it. And it was just like, yeah, no.
So just to clarify, right, that acquisition was the only Apple acquisition of a publicly owned, publicly traded company.
Yeah, so somebody told me that, like, when we were doing it, I was like, no way. They're a very acquisitive company. It turned out to be true, and to my knowledge, it's still true today. It was funny, we were also putting out, like, it was going to go out the next morning. It was going to be on CNBC at 7 a.m., right? We were going to put it out at like 6:58, but send it to them. And so the night before, right, we had R8Q, right, like just was a notice of significant, like was a paragraph long. Like usually they're long and, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, Apple didn't really want to say too much about it. And then they, so I asked the night before, I'm like, you know what, I've never seen their AQ, can I see that, right? And they're like, oh, they're not doing one. It's like, why not? They have to, it's the law. Like, oh, they don't consider it $400 million cash buy a significant event, right? Only Apple, everybody else would, cross their T, not Apple. Apple's like, screw you, we're not doing one of those. Right, and so it's really a very interesting company.
That was car ashtray money to Apple, right?
Yeah, like 400 million.
Who even has an ashtray in their car anymore? But yeah, Jim.
So your friend with MS says to you, hey, I'm going in this nursing home, I have limited energy per day. Can you explain how that becomes your next company?
Well, really, it was, the trip to Rwanda. I just met somebody that was doing so much good in her life and I've been to Rwanda multiple times, but I was just embarrassed, right? Like, I felt like I could do more, and that's when I came back and spoke to Catherine. Lo and behold, there was this company that I was giving advice to whose CEO was an idiot. Really, he just wasn't a good guy. And but his CTO was Jonathan Gould, who I ended up starting. And it was funny because as I was meeting with him, and Jonathan had really come to me when I was doing office hours somewhere, just helping. And he's like, look, here's our company. I think the CEO and others need help, right? Can you help? And I'm like, yeah, I'll try, right? So every time I was in a meeting with him, it was like 3 or 4, I was like, the only thing of value in this entire company is that guy right there, right? Jonathan Gould. And so he's an interesting guy, as are a lot of tech startup entrepreneurs. And so 2 weeks after Rwanda, he texts me. He says, the company folded. Would you be interested in doing a startup? Right? So we actually worked on it for like, he had an idea. I thought it was good, but not good enough, right? And I won't go into it, but we spent like 6 months, right, working on the vision and the architecture of what this would look like. Then formed the company. And then we were looking at other markets, right? So it's this idea of, I won't go, it's an integration engine, right, that integrates multiple technologies into a single system, right? Which sounds like normal, but it's different, right? And so we were thinking about, hospitality and, apartments and office buildings and so on and so forth. I don't even know what senior living or, and who thought of an older adult, right? So we were into it, and then I had coffee, right, with this guy who was introduced to me by a mutual friend. He's an advocate for the homeless, obviously raising money, right? So we had coffee. And at the end of it, he's like, what do you guys do? And I gave him examples of how all these things could work together in a home, although this didn't exist yet. It was just a concept, right? All would work together in a home and, make the home responsive to your needs instead of you trying to have to control everything. So he's like, that'd be a great product for me. I have MS. Wow. Like, I never thought of that, right? So we talked for a while, and the next week, right, Eric, who's now a friend, Jonathan, and me got together. And as I started the conversation, right, kind of introducing, right, the idea here, he stopped me. He used to be a lawyer, but had to retire, very eloquent. And he said, look, let me tell you guys why I'm here today. He says, right now I'm using a cane, but I'm not really sure how much longer that'll last. So when I wake up in the morning, the way I look at my day is I figure I have the energy for 1,000 good steps in my day. And how I use those steps defines the quality of my life, and you guys can make my life better. So I knew, I did feel called in Rwanda. I know that sounds strange to many people, but I did. And then when I met him, I knew why, right? Because the great thing about technology, and it's one of the 2 theses I'm kind of working on my retirement, is you have this ability to touch millions and millions and millions and billions of people that you will never know. I've started talking about it with Catherine a good bit, right? It's this idea of the light that you cannot see. There's a movie and a book, right? It's really good, but I love the kitchen table scene, and I picked up on it, right? The light that you cannot see. It's like these things about doing good, right, without getting credit for it. Like, you don't get likes, you don't get, money, right? You don't, all these things. Everybody's always like, give me credit, give me likes. How many likes did you get on that, right? You're a influencer or whatever they call them, right? All those things, right? It's always about my getting credit. And, we just watched, like a couple of weeks ago, what's that HBO military show? Band of Brothers. Again, I don't know if you ever saw it. It's on Netflix, I think, now. Right? Band of Brothers. And you think about how many people in the military, right, have sacrificed themselves, right, for their country, for their beliefs, for their family, for others. They didn't take credit. Nobody knows their name, right? But it has this ripple effect. And so, I even think in like everything that you do, it's important to do it well. Like, so if you're just cleaning this room and you pick up a banana peel, right, and you throw it away, the next Einstein might have come along. And if that banana peel was there, it would have slipped and died. It's kind of like the whole idea of chaos theory. And so, right, so it's really this whole idea, and that's what I like about tech, is the ability to touch people that you will never meet, that will never know it was you. And that is just not important. And it's all part, right, of reaching with God's hand and Christ's hand. Apologize for the throw-ins there, but but, you know, and affecting the lives of other people. We are, you know, his and their arms, right? And so that's what I like about, like, tech so much. And then that was the revelation, you know, I had when I met Eric.
Is there one more question before we go to the wine shop and network some more? Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to hear a little more about initially raising money for AuthenTec and then leading up to that initial, I think 13 million you said. What was that process like?
Yeah, so I'll give you a perfect analogy of that process, right? You ever see these people on the street, right, holding a sign that says, right, you know, I'll work for food, or, you know, I'll, you know, do something, right, like, you know, give me money. Look, I know maybe some of those people are charlatans, right, but, you know, most of them are good, earnest people that fell on exceedingly hard times. I think of the ones where I see, you know, a spouse or kids kind of on the side, right? And can you imagine standing up and, like, just humiliating yourself and holding up that sign and begging for money? It's humiliating, right? In the end of the day, you hold up that sign, 95% of the people that are going by avert their eyes. They play with their radio, they're on their phone. They will do anything not to make eye contact with that person, right? You know, 4% of them throw something at them or say something. Get a job, you bum, throw a cigarette butt, a can, right, whatever. 1% of the people will stop and give them money. That's a VC, right? The 1%. You have to, like, humiliate yourself almost, right? You're basically begging, you're selling, but you're begging for money, right? And so it is really tough, right? And so you think you have a great...
Florida.
Huh?
There wasn't a Florida venture capital.
No, it was
ecosystem.
hard. Look, we were, you know, our investors included Sierra Ventures, Texas Instruments, the Carlyle Group, AXA, the third largest between the two companies, AXA, the Intel Capital, right? Like, all of these really brand names. But dude, like, I can give you an unbelievably longer list of even more, premier venture capitalists that said no, right? Some of whom were right. So, but, you know, that's part of it, right? And so, but, you know, you have to craft something that's telling a story and providing a vision. But you have to know what the hell you're talking about. It just can't be a vision, and as a friend of mine said the other day, a bunch of word salads, right? Like, it's a bunch of bullshit. Like, you really need to know your space, right? Because I can assure you they do. One of the things VCs do, right, is they focus on specific segments and categories. And the reason they do that, one, I was on the other side of the table looking at making investments and helping some others. There's a lot of chaff. Like, there is a lot. They are, right, 99% earnest people, right, with really bad ideas, right? But, you know, they're all out there, you know, pitching. And so one of the things VCs do is they really only look, right, at a stage of a company that's in their lane, right? So is it seed, is it A, B, C, or D, right? And then they look at, what you're doing. And so when you go in there, I always love it when somebody says, they ask, like, do you have any competitors? And the person says no. That VC knows better. They know the answer, right? Because they saw 3 companies last week that looked just like your company, right? So, you really need to be super prepared, right? You should do a lot of research on the VCs that you want to talk to. You should always have an ask, right? Like, do you know somebody else? Do you have any suggestions? So on and so forth. But it is hard, and you're just going to have to keep. And by the way, I hear this from people all the time. He said he was interested. He said, come back if you do this. VCs hardly ever say no, right? like you must go to VC school and they give you that magic 8-ball with VC answers, right? Because they shake it below and they'll give you the answer. Well, you're too early stage for us. You know, you're not this, you're not that, you're not that, right? Like, so they don't really like to say a hard no because, you know, you may come back later, it may be a good idea, or, you know, it turned out to be a good idea and they want to invest, they didn't want to be rude to you, right? You may come up with another idea that they like, right? So, and you do have to be careful about, you know, even before the VC and institutional, you have to be careful about talking to North Carolina investors. Why? Because they're nice, right? There's a lot of nice people in this state compared to New Jersey, right? So, you know, I meet with people all the time that said, you know, I've presented this and, you know, everybody else, and I'm beating the hell out of them. I try to do it nicely, right? But I'm like, what about this? What about that? That doesn't make sense. Like, you really should learn that, right? I'm you know, annoyingly direct. Which means, just like here, like I speak with authority, which means like but I have, most of the time I have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, right? I don't know anything about your company. I'm just offering you opinions. But, you know, they'll often say, well, everybody else said they liked it. Did anybody give you money? No. They're being nice to you, right? And so what I find is the best person to do due diligence on your business is you. And people don't do it. They don't ask all the questions. They don't know the financials. They don't know this. They don't know who the competitors are. Like, you need to work your ass off, right? So that when you're in front of that person, you know what the hell you're talking about. And you still may not get money, right? Because the other thing people don't realize, sorry, so long, right?
Good.
But the other thing people don't realize about VCs, right, is you have to hit them at the right time. That's why quantity is important, right? Because, you know, it's a 10-year lifespan. I like the VC model. It's kind of a longer perspective than public, which is roughly 3 months, or, you know, 5 o'clock close or 4 o'clock close, right? You know, PE companies are trying to sell you in, you know, 3 to 5 years. On the other side of that, right, VCs have a 10-year horizon. But when they get their money, they basically try to invest it all in like 3 years, all of it, because they need to exit many of these by the 10th year. Now, some of them will be longer and they'll still be in their portfolio, but they don't get paid for those ones, right? I won't go into the details of how they get paid, right? But you know, so you got to really, they have to have fresh money and they still have to be investing it, right? So, you know, that might have been a great VC. But they're raising a new fund, right? They're in the 5th year of this one. You're a brand new seed investment. Dude, they're not investing in a seed, you know, with 5 years to go to an exit. So, but I was, you know, one thing that people told me a lot when I was, you know, I'd worked in a big company, right? You know, really super hard worker. Right. I used to, earlier in my career, I never went to bed on Thursday nights. Like, I would stay up all night, then I would go home and take a shower, and then I would go out to breakfast, and then I'd go back to work. Right. So, you know, where was I? Whatever.
VCs. So that's an area you need to get help, right? If you've never gone through that, VC is an asset class. There's other asset classes depending on where you are in your business journey. The worst thing to do is go to a VC as a former corporate VC and say, I want you to invest, and you're a telephone company, and I'm looking at life sciences. I mean, we get that level of lack of due diligence, and immediately then you're in a pile that says, will not call back. If you do your homework, you have the right team, you have the right message, and you go into a different pile which says, maybe, but not now, maybe sooner, maybe I'll call him back later. And that's a long process. I think that's what Scott was trying to talk about is you've got to be very pointed in terms of where you are in your cycle, what you're trying to do, and then be smart about how you approach those folks.
And there are stages before that, you know, what people call friends and family, which probably won't stay friends and family that long. You know, either once you ask them for money or two, you lose it. And then the second is, you know, seed, right? And that's what, right, Jim does, right, others in this group, right? That's kind of the local right, community that will, make early, investments on you. There's a lot of companies out there, right? A VC firm, a VC institutional money, right? Even at the seed level, they'll probably get 3,000 plans in a year and make investments in 10, 15, right? So it's really a lot of hard work.